A little while ago, I showed in a video a great screen fading system using the URP renderer features. Well, I happen to have this in a library and I drop it into new projects on the regular. Now, each time I drop that into a project, I have to perform some project setup steps manually from a readme file, and I keep those in a library. But let's face it, I'm a tools programmer and I need automation to satisfy a need for completeness. So in this video, I will show you a tool that uses the asset database find functionality to get elements and assign them into the renderer pipeline automatically. But even if you don't use the screen fader, I'm sure there's going to be a gem in this video that'll help you out in the future. So remember to hit the like button if you like what you see, and let's get started. So first off, this one is actually for a supporter of the channel who asked about how to go about getting assets in the project view for their tools. Well, thanks for the support, and this one's for you. I'm going to be using the screen fader from another video, so if you're not sure what screen fader I'm talking about, well, I'll stick a link here and in the description for you to go and check out after the video itself. But don't worry, the concepts here are mostly independent from that actual screen fader. Also to note, if you're liking the scene you see here, make sure to check it out in the asset store. Again, the link will be in the description, and at the time of recording this video, it was actually on sale. To start, let's see the actual problem itself. Now, in my libraries folder, I have my screen fader library, and here you can see the readme with all the details on how to actually set up that screen fader. So if I press stop and I come into my camera, I add my screen fade, you can see here I don't actually have a screen fade feature. And if I press to select it, none actually comes up. There's no options in the project view and in the scene view. So what you would usually do is come into settings, go into your forward renderer, you'd add a render feature, in this case a screen fade feature, you'd give it a new name and all the rest, you'd come into the materials, you'd find the screen fade, you'd select that screen fade, you'd come back into camera, and then you would actually have the opportunity in camera, once that actually refreshes, because it doesn't refresh automatically, so you can actually do that by just pressing the refresh on here and re-import, and there you can see it comes up. Now I can actually go into my camera, select here, and there's my new screen fade feature. Now that doesn't seem like too much of a hassle, but obviously in building this video, I knew exactly where to go and what to do, and I didn't have to go through the readme and do each step in turn. But down the line, I've got loads of these libraries. I'd probably have to do something for each one of those libraries as they come in. Maybe that's to set up defines in the library to have defines appear in all the code, or it's to set up other screen fade features, or just other renderer features in general. So we're going to want to automate this process, and in doing so, learn the components to automate all those sort of processes. So let's get rid of this from our camera, and we'll remove this from our renderer because we want to start from scratch, and we'll just re-import and refresh that so it's nice and clean, and you'll see the arrow disappears because it hasn't got a subscriptable object on that forward renderer, which I'll go into in a moment. So first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to create a menu item at the top here to start this process off. So I'm going to actually create this as an editor script in my screen fade library because I want it to go with each of my libraries. So you can see here I've got an editor folder which actually has the component editors, the inspectors for each of the elements in turn in my effects of this screen fade. But we're going to create a tool. So let's start with a C# script, and we're going to call this one screen fade setup. And let's just open that in Visual Studio. It's not going to be a mono behavior, and we can get rid of the rest of this stuff right here. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is create a menu item, which obviously comes from our Unity editor library, and we're going to name this, and I'm just going to call it, let's call it my tools, obviously give it a better name than that, and then we're going to call it setup screen fade, and we're just going to create the title of the function, and we'll just call this screen fade setup menu option. Sounds good. There we go. Right, okay. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to want to find some elements within our asset database, and that's what this video is all about. So we're going to use the asset database.findAssets functionality, which will give us back an array of GUIs. So here's the array, and we're going to be getting some GUIDs, and that's going to come from the asset database find assets. Okay, so let's have a talk about this asset database find. Basically, you can obviously enter the name of the string you're interested in if you know what the element is called. And you do that without the extension. You can put into here, if you had a clown or something like that in your project and you wanted to find it, you could put clown in here and it would return back GUIDs that matched all the find assets that had clown in their name. But also you can put precursors in there. You can put in things like labels. For instance, if you had a label that you're actually using on an asset, you could use L:, and then a label that's associated with it. And again, you'd get back an array of GUIDs that have that label associated with them. Or, as we're going to do in our case, you could use T, which stands for type. And you could use here something like texture 2D, or as you're going to see, we're going to be using a forward renderer data, and we're going to be using material. Now you can also add on to the end here the folders to search in. Now I'm not bothered about doing that in this project, but if you have particular folders you want to restrict this to limit the amount of search, make it quicker, etc., you can add those into here as well. And I'll leave a link in the description, as usual with all these tutorial videos, to the documentation around this function so you can actually delve in even deeper yourself. And I always encourage that people do that to build their own tools to exactly what they want. So let's get back to it. In our case, what we're actually interested in is we're interested in the forward renderer data. We're interested in all types of that. Now, in our case, we're actually only got one of these forward renderer datas in our project, but you may have several, and it's the same with the material that you'll see in a moment. So be aware that I'm going to take the first one if it exists, but if you actually have multiples, you'll need to actually enter some functionality into here to filter through those multiples and select the one you're actually interested in, or if you're going to do it to all those multiples, perform this action on every single one of the GUIDs. Now what I've done here is I've put in an if statement that says, if this doesn't exist, if there's no GUIDs returned from it because there's no forward renderer data actually found of that type, then we don't want to continue, because why would we want to? That's going to give us nothing. It's going to error out anyway. And we don't want to just give some random null reference error. We actually want to say, there was no forward renderer data found. And we'll just return here because we have no interest in continuing. Now, obviously, if we do find it, we actually want to get a path to the asset. Now, here we have some great functionality as well from the asset database, and that is to do GUID to asset path. And we'll use the first GUID because, as I said, we've only got one in here, so we're quite happy with that. But, buyer beware, if you have more than one, you'll need to do some parts around it. Now we're going to use a caster to go to here, but our forward renderer data actually comes from the rendering universal library, so we put all that up there, and it will be a forward renderer database, and we're going to load that asset. So asset database dot load asset at path, asset database, asset path. Cool. But we see there's a problem there, and that's because no cast. There we go. Forward renderer data. Excellent. Okay, so what we're doing there is we're basically just bringing that in so we can actually use this and we can manipulate it and make the changes we want. Now, obviously, as you saw when I was setting this up, the forward renderer data actually has to have the material assigned to it. So we're going to do a similar sort of thing that we did just there, but we're going to do it with the material. So string, this time we'll specify material, GUIDs, and again, we're going to use the asset database and we're going to do the find assets. but this time we're actually going to, because we know the name of our material, we're actually going to use it here, but we're still going to specify to filter down from materials. So we're going to say screen fade, find all the materials that have this name. And again, remember, you don't need the extension, you just need the actual name of the asset. Now, what you could do here is, if, as I know where the library is, I could actually specify that I could use where this script is actually based. So I could find this script in the asset database and then look back the paths to where the relative path to where I know the material is. But I might override that material or do something with it. So I want to actually do the find assets here for that purpose. So again, we're going to want to make sure that we actually got a material. So let's make sure the materials isn't null, and also, you know, that the length is greater than 0. The length isn't 0, because if it is, well, we're going to throw an error, because again, we want to make sure that everybody knows what's going on. So no screen fade, oh, spelling going awry, material found, and we'll get rid of that D. And we'll return from there. And again, as before, we'll specify the material path and the asset database, go into asset path, and we only want the first one in this case. There we go. And as before, gonna go material, and again, asset database dot load asset at path, material, and the material path. Voila. Okay, so we've got our forward renderer data, and we've got our material, and we've got them all from the find assets. Now, if you're only interested in the find assets and how to do all that, you can leave now. But if you actually want to see how I use this and build it into our renderer, then you can stay, because it's actually quite clever how you can actually manipulate the forward renderer data, and you can manipulate a lot of settings sort of objects in Unity using your tools. You don't have to go and manually do those things. So if you're interested in that, stick around and I'll show you how to do that. Now, in the renderer, what we actually do, and you saw me do it manually, is we set up a screen fade feature. And I actually have this in my own namespace, because I namespace all of my libraries so that they're nice and neat, because I just find it clean. You do you. If you looked at the screen fade effect from the actual video, it's not actually in a namespace, because I'm just showing you how to do it. But here, it's in my library, it has its namespace. So, screen fade feature. That's going to be the screen fade feature. And because the screen fade feature is actually a scriptable object, we're actually going to be creating an instance of it. And screen fade feature, there we go. And close it off. There we are. Okay, now I hate the name it gives it, and I could do something in validation about that, but I'm actually just going to come straight in here and give it a nice clean name, like screen fade feature. There we are. Now, screen fade feature actually has a fade settings associated with it, and that fade settings is where we actually assign the material. So we're going to create a new one of those. So let's just do that really quickly. Fade settings dot material, and here is where we actually assign this material that we've actually picked up from the asset database. So there's our material, and then we're actually going to want to put that into our screen fade feature. So that's fade settings right there. Brilliant. So that's created our screen fade settings, screen fade feature. And again, because it's a scriptable object, you want to use the scriptable object create instance version of it. But one thing that's quite clever about the renderer is you could actually just pop this straight into the renderer now. But the problem becomes is it will error in Unity if you did that. And the reason is it's not actually added to the renderer. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is you can actually nest scriptable objects. So I can have a parent scriptable object that has subscriptable objects actually associated with it. And if you looked earlier, that's where the little arrow came up next to the forward renderer feature that I could drop down and then pick that to go into my camera. So you can do this where you can do the asset database, add object to asset. You pass it the parent you're actually interested in, which is the screen fade feature, and you give it the forward renderer data. So you're adding this object to this parent, and that will actually put it in. Now, I actually use this in some of my own custom scriptable objects. For instance, I have my own behavior tree system. And with that behavior tree system, I have nodes that are present on that behavior tree. And I actually keep those as subscriptable objects because I put data on them and I view them in the inspector, etc. So it's actually quite an impressive tool. So go ahead and have a play with that. So now I've added that as an object to the asset, I actually want to set it into the renderer feature. So I want to add it to the renderer features. So here we go, screen fade feature, and that will simply add it in as you saw me do manually. Now, one thing I like to do when I'm doing these sort of tools is perform some sort of visual validation that the actual thing has happened for the user. So in this case, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to set the active object to the forward renderer data. Now, what that will mean is as soon as I press this, instead of just giving them a log that says, oh yeah, we've done it, it'll be fine, you know, you don't have to look. I'm actually going to show them it and say, yeah, it's set up. Have a look, just visually verify what's there, and then move on to whatever else you're going to do. So we'll select it as the active object, and you'll see how that works in a moment. Now, the asset database becomes a little bit confusing to some people, but when you do all this, it needs to be told, get yourself together, refresh, and also mark things as dirty if they need to be saved. Because if you don't, and you leave the project and you come back, they can disappear because you didn't actually save them. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the editor utility, and we're going to set this renderer as dirty so it knows it needs to be saved. And then what we're going to do is we're going to refresh the asset database by just doing refresh. And the last thing we're going to do is we're just going to save our asset because we've performed our functionality and we're all happy about it. So there we go. So now if I save this script and I come back into Unity, so now if I come to my tools and I put setup screen fade, you'll notice I've selected the forward renderer, it's added the object, it's set the material, and that's the material that can be found. If I press this, that's the material that can be found up here in my library. So it's found that material in the asset database, it's put it in there, and it's found this screen fade feature and renderer to set everything up. So that's that. Now if I'm in my camera and I happen to have my screen fade on there, now my screen fade feature is available straight away for me. So that's awesome. But if you've been on the channel before, you'll know I like to validate my tools. So if we come back up here, we can see I can actually perform screen fade feature again, this setup screen fade. Why would I want to do that? I've already set it up, and you could accidentally get somebody who comes in, has a problem with screen fade and goes, oh, I'm having a problem. Why is this? Oh, I've obviously not been set up, sees this option, presses it, and suddenly they're having problems. So let's validate this in our menu to turn this off if we don't need it. So let's jump back into our Visual Studio and we'll come down the bottom here. Now, if you've seen my things before, you know what I like to do. So I like to actually take the menu name and make it a constant at the top. So that if I change the menu name in this tool, it won't matter that it's changed on one. I won't have to remember that to change it on my validator as well. So menu item, the tool, and we're going to associate this as the validate. And what we'll do is we'll copy and paste that. There we go. And we know this is going to return a ball, and we'll just whack validate on the end of there. Awesome. Okay, so how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to want to validate that these items exist. So let's copy, paste that down here. And instead of putting some debug errors in, we'll just set those as false. So we won't be able to run it if those don't exist. And the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to check whether the renderer already has it. Because if it already has it, why would we bother actually going through this process? So if we take this out here, bring this down, this loads our forward renderer. Now we're going to want to pop through them. So let's build a for loop. I is less than the forward renderer data dot renderer features count. There we go. Nice little for loop. And we'll say if our forward render data dot render features, if this is a screen fade feature, then we'll return false. Otherwise, we'll return true. So what we're saying there is if we already have this screen fade feature set up as a renderer feature in its list, then return false, otherwise return true. Awesome. Let's jump back into Unity. Let that load up. And now if I come into my tools, it's not available. And that's because it's already been set. So if I come into my forward renderer, I remove this renderer feature, do the tools again. Oh, there you go. It's available. And we run it. It's done. And now it's not available. Great. A simple validation to make sure we don't use it twice. So that's it. If we go back in and we put in the screen fade features that we've been deleting and running, if we play, we can play around with our fading. So we're here, we're playing, we've got this great dish of some variety, and we can fade and we can fade. Excellent stuff. And what I'll do is in a future video, I'll actually show you how to set up these sort of tools in a setup wizard. So if you had plenty of these setup options, and you'll see this with some packages you bring in, you could actually bring up a wizard that says, you haven't performed this setup, you haven't performed this setup, do you want to perform this setup? And just let somebody get going really quickly with their project. So I'll show you how to do that in a future video, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. And as always, if you got anything out of this video, make sure to leave a like. And if you're feeling really generous, there's a Ko-fi page, link in the description, so you can always leave a tip. And as always, thanks for watching.